Welcome back to our podcast, listeners, as you are joined for today's episode, Whose Land, Whose Rights, with myself, Scott Cuthbertson, and my partner, Nevin Cohen.
Across Canada, land disputes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups continue to raise big questions. Who truly owns the land, and how should these conflicts be resolved?
Two major disputes highlight these issues: the local battle between James Wattong and Collegers over the wild rice and the national fight for the Wet'suwet'en pipeline. Both raise questions about Indigenous sovereignty, land rights, and how the government handles these conflicts.
Today, we are going to compare these two cases and discuss how land disputes like these can be handled better in Canada.
Let's start with a conflict that played out in Ontario's Kawartha Lakes. James Wattong, an Anishinaabe man from Curve Lake First Nation, had been receiving wild rice, also known as manumin, across the region's lakes.
For James, this wasn't just about growing a crop. Wild rice was a traditional Indigenous food, a cultural staple in his life, and something that was nearly wiped out by colonial policies and environmental destruction.
James was on a mission to plant as much rice as he could to restore what he felt was taken from him, but this upset many of the Collegers living on the lakes he was planting on. James Wattong's work was seen as a nuisance, as they argued that the rice was clogging up the waterway, making it hard to boat and ruining their lifestyle on the lake.
So, the Collegers pushed back hard. They demanded the government do something and even organized efforts to remove the wild rice from the water. But Wattong didn't stop, because for him, this wasn't just about property values, it was about Indigenous rights.
And what did the government do?
Not much.
They mostly avoided taking a clear stance, leaving the conflict unresolved and James Wattong still planting.
Now, let's compare that to the Wet'suwet'en pipeline dispute, where the stakes were much higher.
The Coastal GasLink pipeline was planned to run through the middle of the Wet'suwet'en territory in British Columbia. The government and energy companies signed agreements with elected band councils to do this. But the problem was, Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs never gave their consent.
And the Indigenous rights to the Wet'suwet'en land had ensured the chiefs the final say, not the elected councils. So when constructed moved forward without their approval, protests and blockades across Canada erupted.
Unlike the wild rice dispute where the government stayed out of it, this time they stepped in with force. The RCMP moved in, protesters were arrested, and the conflict became a national crisis.
The big question here was, who got to decide what happened on the Indigenous land? The government heavily backed the $6.6 billion project for economic interests, but the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs made it clear they never surrendered their land.
So, what did these two disputes have in common?
First, both came down to the same issue: who had the right to the land? In both cases, Indigenous groups asserted their sovereignty, while the Canadian legal system and non-Indigenous people challenged it.
Second, both conflicts showed how the government struggled with reconciliation. In the James Wattong case, they avoided taking action, whereas the Wet'suwet'en pipeline dispute, they used police force to shut down the protests from the Indigenous.
We can agree both of these disputes weren't handled very well, but how could they have been resolved better?
For one, Indigenous governments needed to be respected. The Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs should have been involved from the start, not just the selected band councils. This would have potentially allowed for the dispute to be avoided if the chiefs were properly respected.
And in the wild rice dispute between the Cottagers and Indians, there needed to be better communication. Instead of Cottagers and James Wattong clashing, there could have been real discussions about shared land use, rather than just trying to remove the wild rice, such as creating a designated area for James Wattong to plant that would not affect the Cottagers.
Early negotiations could have been prevented both conflicts from escalating. The government needed to be proactive in finding solutions that respected Indigenous rights, instead of waiting for things to spiral into a protest and legal battles.
And most importantly, reconciliation had to be more than just words. If Canada keeps ignoring Indigenous sovereignty, we just keep seeing the same conflicts over and over.
I agree. Thank you, listeners, and we will be back with another episode after this break.